The fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban has led to quite a bit of press coverage, as you've probably noticed. One of the topics that has seen countless type ink spilt is just how much equipment the Taliban have captured. In fact, I've covered that very topic myself. No doubt this will remain a subject that is never resolved with total accuracy, what with the vagaries of the war, how much was sabotaged, and the uncertainties of how much was used by Afghan military forces fleeing the country. But some of the figures put out by the media are, quite frankly, ridiculous. Oh well, I'm sure it all makes for good headlines, which seems to be the point after all. And generally, I'd be content to ignore the uproar and concentrate on information from sources that actually know what they're talking about. But then I saw this.
I find it difficult to believe that Biden could have left them with all this military equipment. When the British left Dunkirk, they made sure that every gun barrel was spiked, that no vehicle was operative. They smashed and destroyed everything.
Now, I'm not going to express any current political opinion regarding this statement or the speaker, because everyone does that nowadays about literally everything it seems, and that annoys me intensely. What I will take issue with as regards to this statement is that it is, from a historical perspective, complete nonsense. So here's a very curtailed summary of the stuff the British left at Dunkirk and what the Germans reused. The evacuation of the British Expeditionary Forces from France must rank as one of the biggest defeats and most successful PR campaigns in the whole of military history. Codenamed Operation Dynamo, the British did pull off the remarkable feat of saving most of their soldiers from France in a naval operation that ran from May 26th to June 4th, 1940. In that time, more than 1/3 men were lifted from the French port of Dunkirk, followed by almost another 200,000 in the following weeks from the French Atlantic and Mediterranean ports. And this effort certainly deserves applause for saving the cream of the British Army, which would serve as the kernel for the rapidly expanding forces and go on to fight for the next 5 years. But in terms of weapons and equipment, the BEF lost just about everything, barring some small arms. These losses would take some time to replace. It would also mean that in some areas the British Army seemed throughout the war to be playing catch up to the Germans because the need to replace these losses set back weapon development and procurement programs. So what exactly did the British leave behind? Well, it's important to remember that in the figures to follow, some was also lost in action fighting the retreat and some was sabotaged by the crews before they left. But all in all, it was a lot. The British lost in France 184 cruiser tanks, 23 Matilda IIs, 77 Matilda Is, and 331 Mark VI light tanks. These losses represented a huge amount of the British tank fleet at the time. About 57% of their cruisers, 42% of their infantry tanks, and 45% of their light tanks. And, as the Germans were critically short of tanks throughout the entire war, they were happy to use whatever they could lay their hands on, especially the cruisers. Though these have a somewhat poor reputation nowadays, in 1940 the British cruiser tanks were as good as most tanks available to the Wehrmacht, and considerably better than the Panzer Is and IIs that made up the majority of the German tank fleet. It appears that many of the tanks captured that were still running were sent to the German Army's assessment centre for testing and troop familiarisation, but several went on to see combat use with their new owners. At least one cruiser Mark II is reported to have been used by the Germans against the British themselves before they'd even left France, and other captured cruiser tanks went on to fight a surprisingly long way away. For example, 9 cruiser Mark IVs served with Panzer Abteilung 100. This unit served through late 1940 until mid-1941 as part of the occupation forces of the Netherlands, as well as training for the proposed invasion of the UK. Then, with the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, the battalion was assigned to the 18th Panzer Division and the Mark IVs marched east. There are few firm details on their service in Russia, but they likely didn't last long in the face of Soviet anti-tank guns and the sheer distances that needed to be covered. Though this seems to be the best recorded, concentrated use of captured British armour, tanks taken in France continued to pop up, with one cruiser Mark III photographed allegedly being used in Yugoslavia in 1943 or 44, probably on anti-partisan duties. The other captured types also saw some use. At least one Matilda II infantry tank was used in the Netherlands up until late 1942, where it was used to practice amphibious assaults. Another Matilda had its turret removed and replaced with a 50mm anti-tank gun with a shield. The light tanks were also used, though again after conversion. The Mark VIs formed the basis for a small run of self-propelled artillery, fitted with either 105 or 150mm howitzers, and also associated munition carriers. These served in Russia possibly until 1943. Additionally, components from the Mark VIs seem to have been used to build half-tracks. The little armoured universal carriers were used everywhere by the British forces during the war, and many were lost in France during the withdrawal. I haven't been able to find out exactly how many were lost, but it was enough that quite a few entered service with the Wehrmacht in a host of roles. On top of being used in their original infantry carrier role, often fitted with German armament, they also formed the basis for several conversions. The Germans built a dedicated anti-tank vehicle based on the Bren carrier, the Panzerjäger Bren 731E, fitted with a 37mm gun, as well as an anti-aircraft variant with a 20mm cannon. Bren carriers would also be used by engineer units in Russia, including remote-controlled variants that acted as demolition vehicles equipped with a 650kg explosive charge. These saw use in Crimea in June 1942, destroying heavy fortifications around Sevastopol. Later in the war, the Bren carrier would also be used as a vehicle by German infantry tank hunting teams, carrying the fearsome Panzerschreck anti-tank rocket launcher. Of other vehicles captured by the Germans, several armoured cars continued in use. Daimler Dingos, most likely captured in France, were used in Russia, and it seems that the type was also used by the SS Totenkopf division. The British lost a huge amount of artillery in the battle for France and subsequent evacuation. This included 704 18/25 pounders, 216 18 pounders, 96 4.5-inch howitzers, 221 6-inch howitzers, and 51 4.5-inch and 60-pounder guns. Also lost were a number of heavy and super heavy railway guns. The exact number uncovered by the Germans are uncertain, and no doubt crews did manage to spike several of their own guns before fleeing. But numbers of these pieces would subsequently be redesignated for German service and be used in coastal defence batteries. Considering that the Germans had something like 7,000 artillery pieces of all sizes available to them at the time, the capture of hundreds, possibly as many as 1,000 guns, was a substantial number. What were also greatly valued were the QF 3.7-inch anti-aircraft guns. These were one of the most advanced weapons of their type in service in 1940, and though the numbers captured by the Germans are unclear, they not only applied their own designation to the gun, but also made their own ammunition for it. 3.7-inch guns would be used by the Germans in Western Europe, and in fact some ended up reportedly being used against British forces that were trying to take the Dutch island of Walcheren in late 1944. Also taken were large numbers of the British 2-pounder anti-tank gun, which were redesignated by the Germans as the 4.0cm PaK 192E. The British lost 509 of these in France, about 60% of their total anti-tank gun strength. That accounts for most of the major items, and in fact represents a rather cut down coverage of what was lost. There was also about 64,000 trucks and motor vehicles, again items that the Germans suffered a critical shortage of throughout the war. The sheer numbers of vehicles they captured must have been a positive boon for the Wehrmacht, and Bedfords and Scammels were used as long as they could be kept running, which might have been quite a while because at least one of the latter was filmed in Czechoslovakia at the very end of the war. I won't even go into the huge amounts of small arms and things like infantry mortars lost, but this was enough that auxiliary foreign units of the German military would employ British weapons throughout the war. And, at the very end, British weapons would be used in the final stands by the Volkssturm in places like Berlin. So, sorry Nige, not only did the British Army leave a lot of viable equipment on the beaches of Dunkirk, the Germans used a fair bit of it for the duration.